We have so many questions. Most of them you're probably not allowed to answer, but we're going to do our best here to try, because you are in an incredibly important area of the Pentagon right now with this emerging technology, although maybe you see it as mainstream because this is an existing threat. Are you busy knocking down threats that we don't hear about? Because the idea was that the threat level would be greatly increased during a war with Iran.
Well, first, thanks for having me back. Yeah. It's always a pleasure to be on the show. What's interesting about Epic Fury, or Iran in particular, is how vocal our leaders have been around the role of cyber or non-kinetic effects. Historically, we've kind of shied away from talking about offensive cyber, but the leaders up to the president have talked about it. Matter of fact, just a few weeks ago, or I guess a couple months ago at this point, the president released the nation's cybersecurity strategy. And in that, they said, look, we have the best cyber operators in the world, and we will be leaning into potential cyber options against adversaries. We're not constrained to just kinetic effects, which is historically, at least publicly, how we have talked.
Well, so when we consider our arsenal of cyber options, if you will, to what extent is that something that is developed in wartime like this? Is this when advances are actually made, or do you have to have all of these options prepared for you before you go into a conflict like this one?
I think it's a mixture of both. What we see, though, is how quickly technology is accelerating. I mean, give you one example is around artificial intelligence. There's many advancements. It's moving at really machine speed, which makes the burden on us to actually be ahead of where we think adversaries are going. A good example is many fear around how AI is going to be used for potential harm or for negative use, especially in cyber. Our question is, how are we using AI specifically for defense or when needed to go after adversaries? Matter of fact, I think adversaries are going to misuse the technology however they see fit. That's why we always have to stay ahead of them. And I think that's exactly what the Army has a history of doing, what we've been really leaning into over the last few weeks, notably.
What does this budget proposal mean for you? We're talking about $1.5 trillion, a 50% increase if, of course, Congress codified what the president has proposed. How much of that would be to cyber, and what would you do with the money?
Yeah, so one of the unique authorities that I have in my role, most people are like, what is this principal cyber advisor? I review and certify all of the funds that we use for cyber. And it goes into a lot. Defense, supply chain security, cyber warfighting, how are we training them? But there's been noticeable advancements. One of them goes back to really AI and cyber specifically. And my quest is, how are we getting as much of that technology in the hands of our warfighter as quickly as we can? An example of something we're really proud of is we just hosted an AI tabletop exercise at the Pentagon. We brought 14 C-suite leaders to really go after how are we leveraging AI for cyber defense agentically? So that way a human operator doesn't have to be one to take a course of action. The AI agent can actually do it. The reason I mentioned that context of budget is we pre-align funding in advance of that TTX. That way, if we generated 1 to 3 prototypes, we could quickly field them and get them in the hands of a soldier in hopefully 30 to 45 days versus that traditional, multi-year cycle that we think of.
Well, just on the subject of AI, obviously Anthropic has had some pretty severe warnings around its Mythos model in particular and restricting access to it because they say it is so good at specifically weeding out cyber vulnerabilities. We've had reporting here at Bloomberg that the White House is trying to get access to Mythos for a number of federal government agencies. Has the Pentagon conducted that kind of exercise to see what vulnerabilities it might be exposed?
Yeah, I think regardless of model, what that's getting at is how quickly the technology is accelerating. I think quicker than a lot of people had expected, to be honest. I think that's why it's incumbent on not only the Army, but the Pentagon even larger to bring these capabilities quicker to the soldier. That way, commercial industry doesn't have a capability, and years later, we're getting it. And I think that was what was unique, is bringing those 14 leaders to the Pentagon. We gave them a discrete problem set, and we said, look, we know you've solved a lot of these challenges early on. Help us. We don't want to start from scratch developing a capability. We want to see what you have or what you think is over the horizon, and then bring it into the Army. That is very different thinking than traditionally how a military department has gone about acquiring something.
To what extent is the Pentagon still using Anthropic technology, knowing that this back and forth is taking place, that there may or may not be a deal for a longer-term arrangement?
Yeah, I can't comment on the specifics of the exact models, but I think it was under Secretary Hegseth's leadership, what is unique is that we have a lot of options available to us when it comes to AI. And I think we're really still at the beginning of where we need to be going with AI. We see a lot of money and resources, time and talent behind leaning into both commercially available options along with generating in-house options when we need them. And I think that's the balance you need to strike. Not starting from scratch, but also realizing that we sometimes need to fine-tune these AI capabilities for defense specific.
Do you have your own model? Is there a Pentagon large language model that's proprietary inside your agency?
Well, what we do see is unique applications of these models. I'll give you an example. You kind of bring it back to cyber. We have something called panoptic junction. The name isn't relevant, but essentially what it does is it's detecting a potential cyber threat. So versus a human being on keyboard having to observe behavior, then doing something, leveraging AI to say, the model's been trained on this. We know it's a potential threat, and then taking a prescribed course of action. And I think that helps close a gap. We know adversaries have a lot of people on keyboard, significantly more than we might get to. How do we close it? Leveraging technology. And that's a model that the Army actually developed in-house, but with commercial partners. So it wasn't like we had to have soldiers and civilians shut in the room. We took an existing product in industry and just fine-tuned it for the Army use.
Well, so when we're talking about technology like this, obviously a lot of physical infrastructure comes with that as well. For AI, you need a lot of energy infrastructure, for example, but obviously there's wider servers to contend with as well. And we've seen infrastructure in the Middle East targeted specifically. So I wonder how you think about the physical security in the cyberspace.
Yes. And this is, many people say, what keeps you up at night? One part of my portfolios, which is unique, is I'm the Army's lead for critical infrastructure, both physical and cyber. It's a fairly new role that Secretary Driscoll put into my office. And I think it's important because we have adversaries wanting to target our critical infrastructure, like electric, water, and gas, on a pretty routine basis. As a matter of fact, in unclassified reporting, we saw threat actors affiliated with Iran targeting our operational technology. So think of the technology that enables the electric, gas, and water to function. And that's unclassified. Historically, you would think that would be the most secured or top secret information. So that's incumbent on us. We have 288 camps posted and stationed in the Army. And the challenge is we can't have a failure. So we need to mobilize people and equipment in a time of conflict. So an adversary could go after a water company that might be lucky if they have a technology department, let alone a security department. But the military bases rely on that. That's why it's a joint partnership, one of which our leadership has prioritized, specifically defense critical infrastructure.
Wow, that's fascinating to see your role be extended to physical infrastructure. Bloomberg had some fascinating reporting about some of the third-party providers that you're working with, knowing that there are some commercial or at least private entities that you've already referred to. Does that increase the urgency for you to protect their infrastructure? If you're on an AWS cloud, their data centers are going to become that much more important, right?
I think that the world is very interconnected now. So it's not like that's a defense-specific application. It's very interlinked now between our commercial providers and us. So sometimes we have Army information on commercial networks, and we have to safeguard that. And I think it's really a partnership model versus we shouldn't see this in silos. If that's an Army problem, or that's a commercial problem, or that's an interagency problem. We need to look for holistic solutions, and that's exactly what we're doing specifically with critical infrastructure. Just this coming Thursday, the Secretary of the Army is hosting the inaugural Defense Critical Infrastructure Summit, and that's essentially what it's doing. We're bringing interagency leaders, industry leaders, local leaders, as well as military leaders together for a day-long summit all around hardening our critical infrastructure, realizing that we can't do this alone. Traditionally, we've done it in silos. That approach is just no longer applicable given the current conflict.
Well, so in what ways does it need to be hardened? Where are our biggest vulnerabilities?
I think it's a matter of looking at who are servicing our installations specifically. And I realize I'm answering in a very military mindset. I'm looking at what installations have no-fail missions where we can't have a disruption because of a potential adversary action. We need to harden those providers. And I think the challenge is there's sometimes small companies. That gas company providing gas to your local installation, they might not be thinking about security. Some have very strong partnerships. What we need to do, though, is raise the baseline so everybody is aware of the potential threat to a critical infrastructure and assist them. This shouldn't just be the Army.
Is this financial assistance specifically, or what kind of assistance are we talking about here?
I think it's a mixture. I think part of it is just having a common viewpoint around the potential threat to a critical infrastructure and letting our industry operators and owners know of the potential liability, or not, liability is not more of the threat they face by our adversaries. But then bringing interagency resources together with the Department of War resources. And that could be technical assistance, that could be financial resources, or it just could be working jointly to solve these issues. And I think one of the byproducts we hope to come out of Thursday is a DCI playbook. So what are lessons learned that we can glean from this first summit and now apply them across installations around the country and perhaps even around the world?
It's really interesting. This is happening at Fort Bragg, right?
That's correct.
So if you're the owner of this small gas utility that you mentioned, you're out there in Wyoming, do you get a phone call from Brandon Pugh? Like how do you connect with these guys downstream and bring them into this conversation?
You know, what's really interesting is most of these garrison commanders and senior base commanders have proven relationships with these folks already. Yeah. I think, but it's leaning on those and expanding those relationships. What's unique here, though, is bringing the interagency partners to the table versus just being an Army level conversation. Right. We want to bring CISA, we want to bring Homeland Security, TSA, and so on to the table around a common problem and see how we can utilize each other's resources. Legal authorities. I think everybody has a unique role to play here.
Well, so clearly that's going to be a summit that we should closely watch on Thursday. There's going to be another summit happening on Thursday that we're going to be watching very closely as well. It's one in Beijing between President Trump and China's Xi Jinping. Where do we stack with China in terms of our offensive and defensive cyber capabilities right now?
Yeah, exactly. To your point earlier, it's kind of hard to talk specifically around adversaries' capabilities. But
you're supposed to say we're winning on both.
Can you give us a general thumbs up, thumbs down?
I think the reality is, though, this is why we have to have the best trained operators in the world. And something that Secretary Hegseth signed out a few months ago at this point is something called Cybercom 2.0. Essentially, that is getting after the man, train, and equip function. So how are we making sure we have the best operators in the world? We can't fall behind. I am very confident sitting here today, we have the very best cyber operators in the world, without fail. I think it's now a matter of making sure that continues. They have the best resources, the best capabilities, and the best tools. Because this is a no-fail mission. They have to be able to defend this nation at all costs. And I'm very confident they are doing that now.
Can I just ask before they start playing the music, if we could knock the lights out in Venezuela, could we not do the same thing in Iran? Why bomb power plants when we can just use a cyber solution?
What's unique about cyber is it's not the perfect answer for everything.
Yeah.
I think there's two flavors of cyber, if you will. How are we using it as an isolated capability? So cyber for cyber's sake, but also using it in conjunction with other types of effects. And I think that's something our senior leaders have said is that cyber should be infused across all domains of warfare. There are cases where it should be isolated, though.